That's quite enough from Mr. Descartes for now. As we noted, his way of thinking about things has a certain plausibility, intuitive appeal, and also lands us with very deep problems. But we mentioned that Descartes stands for the suite of rationalist concerns that have been extremely important in developing thoughts about mind, about reality, about the underpinnings of science, and so on. It's time now to attend to empirical concerns. Empiricism and rationalism, as I said, are not football teams. Rather, they emphasize different sets of concerns that we bring to the table. Perhaps the most important of those people we associate with the empirical position would be David Hume. We'll see a few more now in a minute. And empiricist concerns have to do with the role of the body, with the role of the senses, and with the role of the world in contributing to our experience, as it were. Not assuming that experience or consciousness lies to one side and the physical world lies to the other. And when we focus on the role of the body and our explorative sensory activities in the world, we're aware that anything we deduce or find out might be overturned by further exploration. So the kind of knowledge obtained here is always somewhat tentative, always somewhat uncertain. Now, I mentioned David Hume, but traditionally, Descartes is held in opposition to these three guys, known as the British empiricists. They are, in fact, an Irishman, an Englishman, and a Scotchman. The Irishman is Bishop Berkeley there in the middle. The Englishman is John Locke. And the Scotsman is David Hume, who collectively articulated a whole bunch of empiricist concerns, even though their underlying philosophies couldn't be more different. These are three completely different approaches to understanding, but what they emphasize is that knowledge begins with the body and its activities in the world. So lived experience of being in the world, of perceiving, seeing things in person, is central to all their concerns. So these empirical concerns start with the body and its connection to the world. And it's not that they don't care about certainty. Recall our figure of doubting Thomas placing his finger in the wound. What kind of proof was he looking for? Well, we said physical proof, and we noted that this was an odd notion of the physical because it had nothing to do with the discipline of physics, but it had to do with feeling, sensing, seeing for yourself, and so on. So one sense of physical here is empirical. Empiricism tends to avoid over-abstraction, tends to resist the leap to thinking entirely in mathematical, formal, symbolic, abstract terms, and encourages us to bear in mind, as it were, that the whole body is involved in our encounter with the world. So the tension between these rationalist and empirical concerns will run throughout this module. We will be coming back to these kinds of issues again and again. One area we're going to meet them in is when we turn our attention to development. The development of the human person from infant to adulthood. The kind of assumptions that rationalists and empiricists bring to the table suggest very different perspectives on how to think about about human development. So the rationalist position downplays the role of the senses, emphasizes highly intellectual, formal kinds of thought, and it then is forced, as it were, to place a great explanatory load on processes of biology and evolution, because its view of the developing person suggests that the person comes with a lot of built-in ideas, built-in categories, built-in notions, built-in stances towards the world. Empiricists, with their emphasis on bodily engagement with the world, downplayed this biological inheritance, as it were, and John Locke is famously associated with the most extreme version of this, who suggested that an infant is basically a blank slate. Now, in those days, education didn't use computers. They used slates, very often for writing on with chalk. So the idea is that, think of it as a blank page on which then experience will write. Now, these two positions can be caricatured, and they often come out as a tension between what we call nature on the one hand and nurture on the other hand. Nature being taken as the processes of the world, and nurture those of education, culture, upbringing, and so on. And that dichotomy turns out to be very, very problematic and untrustworthy. What we're doing when we identify the rationalist and the empiricist positions here is we're identifying extreme positions by making clear how they contrast. But nobody would adopt one of these extreme positions to the exclusion of the other. Rather, making a strongly rationalist or a strongly empiricist argument requires a lot of qualification, because we can't talk about everything in the same breath, as it were. So we're not, in this module, going to set out to prove one position right or wrong. We're going to see, what do you see when you adopt this kind of perspective? And what do you see when you adopt that kind of perspective? This will be very helpful as we walk through very many ways of approaching questions to do with human behavior, human experience, as we go on. So the reading for this week includes two articles which outline very different starting positions with respect to brains. They're both fairly recent in the sense, well, they're within the last few decades. So they've come after a long history of the development of philosophy. One of them adopts what is probably the most popular view, at least if all you read was journalists. This is the view that when we're speaking about minds, what we're actually speaking about is brains. So that mind becomes a way, we said there's no agreed definition of mind, but when we engage in mind talk, ultimately we're talking about what brains are doing. This was a popular view at the foundation of the discipline called artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence was a dream born in the 1950s and 60s, probably reached its peak with its original intention about 1980, and that term has changed its meaning over the last 20 to 30 years. The way artificial intelligence is understood, talked about, discussed today has nothing to do with its origins. It's a very, very different business and is of little relevance to cognitive science. So I'll try, as we occasionally encounter artificial intelligence as we go along, I'll try to make it clear what the sense is in which that term is being used. Some neuroscientists of a strongly reductionist bent take this view that to understand mental questions means understanding questions about brain activity. And so the first article is by one of the founders of the discipline of artificial intelligence, Marvin Minsky. And here you can see his approach to the manner in which we reify minds by saying, minds are simply what brains do. So you see, he's getting over a language problem right there, putting his cards on the table and saying, we could approach minds in this way. His approach is one example of what is a dominant orthodoxy within cognitive science called the computational theory of mind. We'll be meeting this very often throughout this module. And it emphasizes strongly rationalist perspectives, and it starts with this very intellectual, abstract, neurocentric view of what mind and experience are. Against that, there are many, many schools of contemporary thought that emphasize empiricist concerns. And there's a complementary article there by Louise Barrett with a great title, Why Brains Are Not Computers, Why Behaviorism Is Not Satanism, and Why Dolphins Are Not Aquatic Apes. As you can see, there's quite a lot of topics discussed in that article, and that represents a rival view from the world of embodied cognitive science. And we're not going to try and resolve those issues, but as we progress throughout this module, we'll be steering between matters to do with the body, the senses, matters to do with the mind and reason, the mind reified in a particular way. And this territory will become very familiar as we go along.